And welcome to another episode. We are in episode 21 of Dynasty Mind, and I've had a series of great Dynasty Mind, and I'm adding to my great list of people who just enjoys this game of Dynasty football. But nobody, not a whole lot of people dive into football deeper than my upcoming guest, Mr. Kyle Francis of Dynasty Football Factory. Kyle, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm great, Chris. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for joining me. I mean, I'm excited. I've been trying to just figure out a list of guests, and for someone of your caliber, where I draw a lot of my information from concerning dynasty, concerning rookies, upcoming players. This is no better time. There's no better time than right now to kind of pick your mind about dynasty football. So welcome. And tell us a little about yourself. How did you get involved with football? How did you get to this degree of fantasy that you dive into players that 80% of us don't even bother knowing until they become draft eligible?
Yeah, well, thanks for the kind words. Really appreciate that. So my background is pretty much, it's been more in the college fantasy football realm, and I still do quite a bit of that. But background being focusing on the college game, and used to do a lot of daily fantasy in the college when that was a little bit easier to do, when they used to have that for college football. From my understanding, they still have it now, but it's not on a platform that I'm familiar with. I haven't kind of jumped back into it, which is unfortunate. But yeah, just a background in college football, and then really wasn't even, it was probably just a little bit over a year ago now where I really became familiar with what dynasty formats were. So I'm pretty new to dynasty altogether. Like I said, with my background being in the college game, and I played a lot of redraft in NFL, but really enjoyed just kind of everything about college football more than NFL. And then really through Twitter, became aware of Dynasty, and then specifically devy, which I'm sure some of your listeners know about, maybe some others not, but just that's the incorporation of college players into dynasty formats where you can draft them while they're still college players. So that's kind of my focus. My background would be more on college and on devy, or the developmental side of things. And so that's how I got into it.
Oh, that's awesome. It's not a traditional path. Most people that I know, myself included, we began with NFL football. We started with that, and then we begin to, over the last decade, we started to seeing the importance of knowing the rookies. They are not
Sure.
sitting behind players anymore and waiting and learning. They're thrown straight into it, and we've seen a lot of successes with that. But for you to start off with college as your football, do you have a team? Do you have a college school? How did you fall in love with the college, with your college team?
Yeah, so my team is at University of Alabama. So I've been fortunate to enjoy some good years here lately. When I was there earlier on, early 2000s, we were just hoping to go to a bowl game, and now the expectation is to win the title every year. So I've kind of seen the ebb and the flow of how that can go. But yeah, definitely thankful for where things are at right now.
Wow, Roll Tide. That is the team, the New England Patriots of college football team,
Hmm.
as most people would call it. And certainly, even before I was aware of football, Alabama has, for the last 15 years, I think, has been dominant. So that's all I know about college football. Every time we get to a bowl game, it's like, oh, is Alabama there? Yeah, of course. And this year was a special path for them to even get to the BCS bowl, BCS championship. Yeah, how were you nervous when they didn't even make it to the SEC championship game?
I was at that point. I had just kind of decided, like, okay, can't make it every year, just not our year. And then when we got the shot, and then how things transpired, even going down to the final play, I mean, it was that you wouldn't believe that if that was a movie, right? You'd say, like, this is too unrealistic for it to finish the way that it did. So it was awesome.
Yeah, of all the championship that I've seen, watch Alabama won, this one was definitely one of the greater, the best ones that had to take them all the way to overtime. So it speaks well to where UGA, where Georgia is headed. But at the end of the day, Alabama's still king.
Hmm.
So since we're transitioning in this time where a lot of players are very excited about learning more about the younger players, and recently we just had the NFL Combine. So tell us, what is some of your sense of what the NFL Combine has done for you, and what are some of the information you've taken from the Combine?
Yeah, and so I think that as it pertains to me with the combine, I enjoy it, but I look at it more like a singular event, and it's fun and enjoy watching it. But as far as my evaluations go, I'd say that makes up just a very small percentage of that for me. I think that it's really going to depend from an individual to an individual, and dynasty owners, that some people are going to not want to do. They're going to put a lot of stake into that, and they're going to put a lot of emphasis into how players test. For me, it's not quite as important. It's just a piece of the puzzle. I don't really have a percentage or a fraction of what it means to me. I'm not sure. I think for some players, it's more important than others. Like there were a couple of players that, a guy who will probably be a late round rookie pick, Justin Jackson, the running back from Northwestern. I knew about him because of how productive he had been at Northwestern, but I knew he was a little bit smaller, and I just wasn't sure how athletic he really was. And then I was really looking forward to see how he did at the combine. I thought that was going to be pretty telling for, does he have a future? And then he came out and tested really, really well. And so for me, that was kind of like, okay, that maybe that is a guy to target in the later rounds of rookie drafts. So there are some guys when it's hard to get a sense for one reason or another, because there's just some leagues, some positions, it's just harder to gauge athleticism. And so he was a guy, just for example, that I gave him a big stock boost because of what he did. And I just think in general for NFL teams, some will put a heavy emphasis on it and they just are consistently drafting the top athletes. And then other guys and other franchises, it seems like they don't watch it at all. One of the things that the last thing I'll say about it is that I think that there is some merit to minimum thresholds. And so just kind of looking for a specific, do they hit a benchmark? Does a player hit a benchmark in a certain exercise? That can be helpful because there's a lot of now data to support. If players don't, it's if this, then that. And so you can kind of see from a scientific standpoint, okay, these are really important, but we'll get into it a little bit further, I'm sure, in the show, but I also do think that the game is changing quite a bit. And so I think that that's going to be a moving target as we move forward.
You bring up two important points that I want our audience to kind of pay attention to. One is that the combine is a piece of the puzzle. It is something that perhaps it's helpful for people who don't have the time to watch every single college players, and for people who need more of a standardized ways to just making sure that people can reach a threshold, like you mentioned. They need to be at the least show off certain characteristics, traits, whatever it is that can be tied back, translated back into the NFL. The other thing you're pointing out, and perhaps we'll discuss a little bit more, is the game is changing. I had guests on previously that are mentioning, the game is definitely influenced by the college players, influenced a lot by college schemes and planning, and players are succeeding in those plays. So those are two important things that we need to think about as dynasty players, because we can't hold on to too much of the old, this player needs to be XYZ size and has to show this type of speed in order to succeed. So were there any players from last year's class that, you were ahead of the curve over everyone, over majority of people?
I would say that there was like one guy in particular that, are you talking about rookies from last season?
Last year. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think the one thing for me, and again, at that point, I was still pretty new to Dynasty, so I was still trying to get a feel for who are the voices that I should be listening to, what exactly am I looking for in all of this, and so I was kind of in such an infant stage of that for me. So I think the one player that jumps out to me, for example, would be Dede Westbrook, the receiver for the Jaguars. If you look at just what he did in college, specifically his final season, he was, I'm not saying he was my number one rated wide receiver coming out, because that wouldn't be the case. But in terms of productivity and what he put on the field from a blend of his efficiency and explosiveness and several other things, there wasn't a player that came close to him in last year's class. And again, that's just the data. That's just looking at a few different things that I like to analyze. But seeing him, I mean, I know that he was going in the fifth round of a lot of rookie drafts and had a pretty productive rookie season. And even he was hurt for a portion of it, but he was a guy that when looking at the totality of the dynasty kind of market, I thought that the opinions on him were a little bit off, at least in my perception.
Yeah, absolutely. He was one of my favorite too. But of course, coming into the season, we were all mostly focused on his character issues, more so than his production, the things that he can do. We're not expecting him, of course, with his size and whatnot. We didn't see a wide receiver. We didn't expect a wide receiver one, and so far, he's at the least meeting the expectation for a player with a role in the team and can really be very, very good down the line. If only they can get him a better quarterback. But we might not get that for another 3 years, apparently. No. So, Francis, this is a fantastic opportunity for me because you mentioned that you are new to the Dynasty realm, but the things that you've put on online, on Twitter, the things that you share, it seems so much like a veteran in this Dynasty world, and that speaks well to the growth that you have shown. So it also gives me a chance to kind of discuss with my various guests, because everyone are in a different stage in their development of a process. So in your words, what is your process look like right now when you're preparing for the Dynasty season?
Yeah, so for me, I just recently did a dispersal draft, and that was my first time doing that. I did a couple of startups last season, and so like I said, that was pretty early on for me in what I was doing. So I was still trying to get a feel for a number of things, and I when I do something, I generally like to research it a lot anyway. No matter what I do, I don't just kind of put one foot in, and so I felt I was as best prepared as I could be. I have 3 dynasty teams right now that I'm currently doing with NFL. I have some others for college and different things like that, because I actually have college dynasty as well, which you know a little bit about. But from the standpoint of, I kind of took 3 different approaches as it pertained to creating those teams, and I'm kind of doing it just sort of, I don't know if I set out really wanting to find this, but now I'm kind of, because of my choices, now I'm kind of looking back in the rear view. And the first team that I created, I was pretty rigid. I was by the book. And what I mean by that is I pretty much followed ADP as a kind of as a guide for me. I was pretty strict with that. There were several guys that I liked, but I didn't necessarily jump up for them because I was just kind of trying to stay more to the script and see where that took me. That's probably my most competitive league that I'm in to begin with. And I had a pretty average season in that, when I just missed the playoffs in it, but I think I'm set up pretty well for the future. So that was kind of the first team that I did. The second was kind of a blend of, okay, I'm going to really use ADP and kind of what the market is saying as a guide for me, but then I'm also going to jump in. I'm not going to be scared to go up and get a guy, even if it looks like a couple rounds ahead. I'm going to take, my guys, quote unquote there. And that I actually liked. I like doing that. I think that was a good fit for me, of just kind of using some of the data, using a lot of the information that we have access to, while also understanding that, okay, my perception of certain players is valuable. And so I want to go out and get these guys. And so that was actually a more successful league for me. Again, kind of a small sample. It's only been 1 season, but I made the playoffs and did pretty well. And then most recently, I just mentioned the dispersal that I did. And in this one, I'm just going to take guys that I want to take. Like, I'm going to fill a roster with a bunch of guys that I think are really good players, and I'm going to get them whenever I feel like I can get them, and we're going to see what's going to happen. And so that was really satisfying to draft, a bunch of guys that you like and are like, okay, this guy, could potentially have a lot of upside. And it's actually a best ball league, which is different than some of my others. So in a lot of ways, I'm looking forward to that, because then you can kind of take some of those risks on guys that they may do nothing for several weeks, and then, they just blow up for a week. And so that's kind of my approach of how I've built my teams. As far as managing them, I would say that I emphasize younger players because of my background. I'm just more familiar with the new crop of players. In this most recent dispersal draft, I was able to take a lot of devy picks, and so I'm pretty loaded up on both current rookies that I like, and then I have maybe 8 other guys that are going to be coming into the league next season that I'm really looking forward to as well, because I perceive that to be my biggest advantage is just going in for guys that are in college that if I have a leg up at all, and it's still an if, then I feel like that's where I can best exploit that area, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, definitely it makes sense. And I really like your approach of just testing out different things, what is already out there, what is established, using this ADP approach, and then using a mix. And now you're using more what has led you to like these players. You know more about the certain younger players, and I'm excited to hear about how that develops. So you're still in that phase of trying to hone down, but you're trying out different strategies and combining different things. But at the end of the day, you're designing a team that you like, you enjoy, and you're really picking up on the players that works for you, because you know them, you've seen it, you've trusted your own eyes and ears about what these players will bring into the NFL. So that's a very interesting way of starting. So let me know, since it's such new, what is like one of the biggest evolution in your approach coming from last year to this year?
I think one of the things, maybe it may not be as much a personal change in me, but maybe something as far as, keying on the word evolution that you just said, is just, and you touched on it briefly, of just understanding that the NFL is a copycat league. We've heard that a lot, and even just let's look back at some of the hires that were made this past season. So they were a little bit non-traditional, but with like Shanahan and McVay and some of the younger, more innovative minds were hired. And so when I look at that, I think that, these are guys that are closer to your age and mine than, guys like Bill Cowher in the past have been, who have just felt like, oh, that's the generation older than me. These feel like more kind of plugged into, they could get on Twitter and they, could interact with us. And so one of the things that I think about that I've been impressed hearing Sean McVay talk about is he talks about how many plays he steals. He's constantly looking for plays that he sees in college football. He's constantly seeing highlights and film from other NFL games that he sees a good play, and he wasn't shy about saying, I saw him mention on the NFL Network several times, like, hey, I copied that play. I got that play from so-and-so, and it works, and it's something that I like. And even more recently, I read a report that he actually ended up sitting next to Baker Mayfield, Oklahoma's former quarterback, on a flight. And I have a feeling a lot of their conversation had to do with Oklahoma's offense that they run, because, again, going back to tying it back into the evolution, is we're seeing a lot of these offenses that a lot of Big 12 college teams run, and the run pass option, the RPOs, which we're hearing a lot more about in NFL broadcasts. With the game evolving and moving more towards that, I think it's important to look at specifically, even within that league, well, what types of players are successful? What types of players are winning? Because if we believe that that is the direction that at least a portion of the NFL is moving towards, we want to be able to find players that fit into schemes like that, and then hopefully they'll be able to translate. So I think for me specifically, kind of looking into trying to forecast, okay, not everybody that I draft is going to be a Todd Gurley. They're not going to be huge. They're not going to, just be the elite of the elite. So understanding that a lot of the other players that I'm going to be looking for, what type of role, like, are they going to have a role? And is that going to fit into kind of the makeup of my roster construct? And so I think for me, it's just understanding that I don't have to swing for a home run every time, but if I get a lot of players that I'm confident will be role players now and moving forward in the future, I think I set myself up pretty well, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it definitely makes sense. And you're putting it in such a very, for lack of a better word, an eloquent way, that we are evolving along with the NFL. McVay, we have Shanahan. I think he's still young. I don't know how old he really is, but a lot of these coaches are not afraid of telling you, hey, we're going to borrow things and we'll make it succeed. If it succeeds, we'll keep doing it. Sometimes I may think that McVay is like the coach that the Shanahan version that uses any type of receiver well, where Shanahan uses any type of running back and you plug and play. And but it really speaks to, you know, how the game has changed. I've used to be a very low on Big 12 or the Pac-12 kind of teams because I know how are they going to translate to the NFL, and I realize now it's an old way of thinking. We're not the SEC, the ACC, of course, they still bring in great talents on both sides of the ball, but we now have to recognize we're opening to new and creative ideas of using players, and they don't always have to be perfect prospects. They don't have to be players that run the full route tree or players that carries a 225-pound frame and run between tackles. You'll see a lot of different ones that are succeeding, like the Duke Johnson or like D.D. Westbrook was another good example. We even see Keelan Cole, who does not have any of those attributes that NFL team would look at and say, oh, this will be a future great contributor for our team. So that's a great way of putting how you evolve along with that. So going into this season, going into this off season, values are going to be dropping. Values are going to be rising. We see the effects of free agency already, and it's really making teams change the way they'll go into the season, as well as what we're expecting from the draft. How are you, how are you using your process to guide you through this season of chaotic fluctuations of values?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that for me, it's trusting some of my past evaluations. What I don't mean by that is not saying getting stuck on a certain player. I think that there's a lot of people that you could probably name a player or two that you just have had the hardest time, that you just have believed in for, one reason or another, but then they just haven't materialized the way that you would have hoped, for your dynasty team. So I think that there is a great value to finding a player that you are confident in, you believe in, and sticking to your guns, but also understanding at some point it's time to move on and move forward. So I think for me, a lot of it is just not giving up on players too fast. I would say that would be one thing, is really not getting too concerned with what they did, especially if I'm building a somewhat younger team, of not really looking at last year's productivity and seeing that, expecting that's how it's going to be the same moving forward. So I think for me it's just continuing to take in new information. I think is something that's really important for me just in my process. One of the things that I do, I actually don't read when I read about football. I actually don't read too many opinions of fantasy analysts. I think that is where there is a lot of good and benefit that can come from that, but also at the same time, I think that we can see a lot of things that, I'm reading about football from other sources, and I think that's really helped me specifically to learn and to grow, and maybe I find some slight edge in getting someone else a brilliant football minds that maybe isn't geared towards fantasy, but picking up some insights from them and then being able to help apply it to my process as well. So that's something for me. And I imagine that's probably not all that common. I imagine that a lot of people that are very into fantasy football will want to read the opinions of other fantasy analysts. And I'm not saying I absolutely do that. That's part of it. But I'm also trying to get information from a lot of different sources. I learned stuff from different sciences, for example, that help then apply to football as well. You can take anything in your life and then apply it to football, and there can be a benefit if you're willing to kind of have an open mind and look for maybe the road less traveled with information.
Absolutely. I think you put it in a very good way. Something that I use in my process as well is before I even read analysts, because I do rely some of my choices on people who spend way more time, who are able to dissect the game better than I am and use that information. But first, I want to have my own take on it, what I can learn from it, and then maybe apply it later. And maybe and all of the time you'll find some disagreements between you and your league mates regardless how much information is out there, there's always a difference somewhere, and where you have to make a choice. And that's where we find where we can find a room to negotiate trades, or find a way to know how much blind bidding dollars to put in for a player in the waiver wire, and even how we draft on the upcoming draft. Segue into rookies. Now we're going to touch in and apply your process. Tell us about a rookie that you like or dislike more so than what you're hearing right now from the Dynasty community.
Sure. I think a quarterback for me that I have kind of been on the bandwagon for a while now is Lamar Jackson. Thankfully recently in the Twitter sphere, we haven't seen as much of the conversation about him moving to wide receiver, with just as ridiculous as all of that was. That was hard to read and take people seriously. I appreciate everyone's right to an opinion, and if you have Twitter, you can share your opinion right away. So I appreciate that aspect, but that personal opinion, I just couldn't disagree anymore with it. So Lamar Jackson is a guy for me that I have had in college fantasy. I've targeted him any time that I could have had him there. And, because we're on the discussion of, talking specifically about fantasy football, I just want to illustrate a point with Lamar Jackson as it pertains to a lot of people who are listening may not play college fantasy. So Lamar Jackson scored, I believe it was about 39 fantasy points per game last season. Now, the 12th highest scorer in all of college football. Now there's, like I'm saying, just count down the line. Number 12. So another elite player, I believe, scored 12 points less per game than he did. So we are talking about, just amongst elite players, we're talking about, hey, 12 points. I'd be thrilled to get that from two players some weeks. And then that's his advantage over the overall 12th rated player in college. So again, the game changes to a certain degree in the NFL. I wouldn't expect 40-point outputs necessarily from many quarterbacks. But I think when looking at his rushing ability and the damage that he can do with rushing touchdowns, and how that those count for more in a lot of ways, I just think that that's an aspect of quarterbacks' games that I love. I want a quarterback that can do damage with his legs, and so that's something that I personally value quite a bit. And I know that he's kind of a polarizing figure, where some people have him all over the map, but I believe in him as a quarterback, and I have him on any team that I've been able to target him and get him.
Awesome. Yeah, Lamar Jackson is definitely one that I agree, see with you eye to eye on that he is a quarterback. I didn't entertain any of the thought that he should transition to a wide receiver. Ryan Tannehill has a better chance of turning back into a wide receiver than Lamar Jackson. And Lamar Jackson's been awesome. He was I think he was on consensus #1 pick in the college football. Mostly the 2 QB leagues, but also you just have a massive advantage of having him. And so I'm looking forward to where he lands, and I really think I'm on the same line as you. He will give you that advantage both from his arms and from his leg, and he is a quarterback, and he is the quarterback of today's NFL. Awesome. So we learned a little bit about your process. We learned how you would apply it to this season. So now we're heading into our last segment, the ink blot test. Basically, this is my little informal test of just throwing the names out there for you, and you are using your brain to just crunch down all your processes and tell me what you think about these players and how you're going to handle them going into 2018 season. So are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right. Chris Carson.
Okay, so what an interesting guy here, because I know that there's a lot of analysts that put a lot of weight into draft capital. And for those who may not know what draft capital is, and if you do, forgive me, but essentially, how much is a team investing in a certain player? Because that's a big part of Dynasty. If you're a round 1 pick and you're getting a lot more essentially guaranteed money, then teams are going to be a bit more patient with you. If you're drafted in the 7th round, like Chris Carson was, I think he was actually maybe like the second to last I mean, he was like one of the second, I think maybe one of the very last picks in the entire draft last season. That there's a lot of people that will believe, okay, well, maybe he's not as valuable because he can easily be cut. Now, I don't think that many people are saying that anymore after the, kind of truncated season that he had last season. He got injured, but he certainly showed off an ability that I wasn't quite ready for, to be honest. I really didn't have a strong opinion about him one way or another coming out. I just wasn't sure exactly how he was going to be utilized. But again, he's a guy, to kind of circling back, he was a role-playing back in a Big 12 offense. And so I think that it's interesting that he came out was as successful as he was. As far as my opinion of his valuation moving forward, I would really need to see the Seahawks invest more on their offensive line. I think that most advanced data and metrics had them as one of the top 3 worst run blocking offensive lines, probably pass blocking as well. I mean, Russell Wilson was running for his life, every week, but he's the guy that I think is really interesting. He doesn't kind of conform to some of the popular narratives and what people look for, but he would be a guy that I would be looking for, especially as we're now seeing that, Rawls may be moving on and a couple other guys that are in the mix there. So I do like him as a player, but I don't know.
We may have lost Kyle for a bit. Maybe some internet connection. Oh, there, he's back.
Hey, sorry about that. But
No
I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I looked at his recent ADP was at 145. And so at that point, I think that I'm pretty interested in him. I wouldn't want to necessarily build around him, but at that point in the draft, I mean, that's around the 10th round. I mean, I'm interested in a player like him that I think has the skill set to contribute as a pass catcher and potentially could be a feature back for them as well.
Yeah, definitely. With the recent news of Mike Davis not being re-signed, they haven't really kicked the tires on any running backs I've seen so far. So that's a very interesting take, and I agree with you. It really does serve to take a step back and see what Seattle does. Okay, my second player that I throw to you, he has a similar type of journey to a role in 2017, and we're really interested in seeing what he's going to do this year. What do you think of Alex Collins?
Yeah, you're exactly right. That is kind of interesting that both of these guys wouldn't necessarily probably be, if early round picks and draft capital is a major driving force in your process, you're probably not going to have either of these guys unless you traded for him, and then maybe not even then. But I actually do have Alex Collins on one of my rosters, which was a really pleasant surprise. I don't remember where I picked him up, but I know his current ADP I saw was about 110. And so I think even at that, there's value with him at that number. I think that there's a lot of guys going ahead of him that are going to be, I feel more strongly saying that they're going to be role players, where I think he actually has the opportunity to be a feature guy again. I think that he has the skill set. I think that he has what it takes to do it. I think that Baltimore their skill group right now is not good at all. So I imagine a lot of their emphasis is going to be on wide receivers. I do think they probably could add another running back, but I don't think it's going to be someone that they're going to want to jump up and grab Darius Geis right away in the first round or anything. I don't foresee that scenario playing out. So Alex Collins is a guy for me that I liked him in college a lot, and I like him a lot now as well. And even just looking at Pro Football Focus's grades last season, they have, I don't recall exactly which categories they were, but he graded really well in several of their categories on some of their different metrics that they put out. So I'm pretty optimistic about Alex Collins. He's a guy that he would be another guy that I thought was probably a better football player than maybe some of the collective dynasty perceived him to be.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Alex Collins was an interesting one. I did like him out of college. I probably did abandon my hopes for him pretty early on when he got cut. And when he got scooped up at this practice squad body and I see everyone starting to pick him up, I was like, what am I missing? So I already missed the boat on that. But yeah, that's exciting to hear. And you're absolutely right. The Ravens have a lot more areas that they need to address Maybe adding Crabtree will help a little, but it doesn't really fix a lot of the issues that they have as far as the offense goes. And their offense was predicated on the run last year, and it only served them well if they continue to use the running game. All right, my last guy to you. This one is Left for Dead, Spencer Ware.
That's a good way to describe him. I actually, when I was kind of digging into him and trying to find what his ADP is right now, I asked a friend of mine, hey, do you have the ADP on Spencer Ware? And he said, well, there's no ADP right now. He's actually not even being drafted, which actually came as a big surprise to me because, I mean, my goodness, how much the tide can change in one season. I don't expect that he's going to, be take over for Kareem Hunt at this point. I think that his role is now pretty well cemented. But I mean, this is a guy who's still a pretty good football player. I think he could still play a role. And I think what's interesting, even as it comes, and we didn't touch on this when it comes to building teams, but I'm very fine with finding offenses that I like, and not necessarily, I know that the term handcuff is popular. Like if you have a certain back, then take their backup as a handcuff to kind of protect yourself if you're building a team around kind of a cornerstone player. And I don't have Kareem Hunt in any of my leagues, unfortunately, but even if I didn't have him, Where would be a guy that I'd be interested in a roster spot, because I think that if something were to happen to Hunt, which happens to players every single year, I mean, we wouldn't know, most people wouldn't know Kareem Hunt's name had it not been for a cascade of injuries that happened just a year ago. So I think that the door can always open up for a player like him. And I think that while I wouldn't expect him to be a high value commodity, he's a guy that for me, I'd like to have him on my roster. I think that he has some value as kind of a stash, and not expecting too much out of him, but hey, he could absolutely, if something were to happen to Hunt, or any circumstances change there, then all of a sudden he becomes a player that's pretty interesting and could have some value.
Absolutely. It's really surprising to hear that he has no ADP whatsoever. Spencer Ware, that has caused me a lot of grief. I don't know if you were there with me last year. I lost an avatar bet, so I kind of stick with a very terrible one. What I said in the offseason before he got hurt, I said Kareem Hunt is not taking over the job as long as Spencer Ware is there, or he will not take over the job coming into this season. Of course, Kareem Hunt just become the leading rusher. So I have to be careful what I say now and
right.
what kind of bets I take. But yeah, never rule anything out with Andy Reid offense. I think that's one of the reasons why I still have him on my radar, is because we've seen enough frustration with Akeem Hunt sometimes sneaking some carries away from Kareem last year. And so let's not rule out Spencer Ware. He was good. He's not the best at everything, but he was at some points in his before, and I think in 2016 he had a good major role in that offense. So thank you so much, Kyle. You have been a wonderful guest. It's fascinating to learn from you, to dig into your process, and it's exciting to hear that you're growing yourself in your process too. So you'll have a fantastic future in Dynasty Twitter. Tell us, what are some of the works that you are doing upcoming? Where can people find your work? Where can people find you?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks so much. Really appreciate the kind words and appreciate you having me on. That's really an honor to be on. So thanks again for that. Secondly, on Twitter, you can find me at FranchiseKF is my handle. As you mentioned in the beginning of the show, I write for DynastyFootballFactory.com. A lot of my focus is going to be on the college side of things, as well as I mentioned previously, the devy or developmental side of things. So I'm going to be talking about rookies, as well as players in the next few years that will be rookies. And one thing that I wanted to mention, if there's any other of your listeners that are interested in learning more about players that are currently in the college game, or more about the rookies, we're actually working on a project that we're going to be releasing in the next few weeks, where the name of it is the Devy Watch. And that's actually a podcast as well that we have at DynastyFootballFactory.com. It's the Devy Watch podcast, where a couple of my colleagues share about a lot of some of the stuff that I've discussed with college players and how they project to the future. And it's just full of tons of great insight. But this particular project that we're working on, we profile, I think we're going to have close to 250 players this season. That is going to be players that are going to be eligible next year, all the way down to incoming freshmen in college. And so if you're wanting to get a leg up on some of your league mates and understanding maybe who are some of these rookies that you're going to be drafting in the future, if you're not in any devy leagues, or if you play in any devy leagues, it can help you draft guys right now. And again, just kind of going back to what I said, I think that there can be such an advantage for that, just kind of going back to devy, just if you'll allow me for a second. But with the amount of information that's out there in sort of the mainstream NFL dynasty, there's no shortage of opinions, and all of our league mates can read these same opinions as well. So oftentimes it just comes to everyone trying to gnaw on one bone and trying to get one player. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The advantage to being ahead of your league mates in devy means that you can get these players early on before a lot of your league mates even know who they are. And then you're built to last in the future if you pick the right guys. And we're hopeful that, we've put in the work that will help you do that. So anyway, yeah, that's just what I wanted to say about that.
No, that's awesome. I'm looking forward to that. Definitely for devy, it's been the longest time. People were like, it's always a shot in the dark. We have no idea what happens. But now we have people like you and your colleagues working at DFF to help us hone down our pool of players. We'll get to know them before they even hit mainstream media, or before anyone else has picked them up. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Kyle. So this episode again, the feature handle is at FF Dynasty 101. I'm running a contest. If you like this video, follow my Twitter. I pinned it on my Twitter how to participate. If you win, you will get a rookie draft guide or a devy draft guide for free, and just share it with your friends, follow the rules, and I hope to see you guys and hope to hear from you. If you enjoyed Kyle's process, comment below what you learned from this episode, and just let me know. So Kyle, thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks so much, Chris.